Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum. More specifically, we're going to talk about the ETH Bitcoin valuation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, for a number of years, I have suggested, more than suggested, almost outright demanded that ETH Bitcoin drop to the 0.03 to 0.04 range. And it is there now, right? It has been there for a little while. 0.033 right now. Um, and my base case has been that ETH Bitcoin will bottom in the 0.03 to 0.04 range. Now, I could be wrong. It's always possible it goes lower. But the thesis is still there, right? The thesis is still there, 0.03 to 0.04. And there's a number of things we could look at. And in this video, I want to talk about, when will it bottom? Has it already bottomed? What's the latest I could see it bottoming? It just popped back above 0.034. If you're new to the cryptoverse, you're probably looking at the crypto markets, and there's a lot of stuff moving, right? Everyone's having a good time. Um, I'm pretty sick right now, which is I probably would be doing a live streaming right now if I weren't. I just wanted to keep it a little bit shorter. And what you look for with all Bitcoin pairs is you look for double bottoms, and usually when they get that, they then get a really strong rally. And I've been covering some of those over in ITC Premium, but with the alt season that people want, right? That in order to truly get it, ETH has to join the party, right? In order to truly get the alt season that you want. Now, I know what you're thinking, right? You're probably like, well, hold on a second, Ben. Altcoins are doing great right now. And they are, right? I'm not trying to diminish that fact. I mean, it is a fact right now that altcoins are, in fact, doing well. And I told you guys that I was taking my maxi hat off at 60% dominance, right? So you don't have to tell me they're doing well, right? I said it made sense to diversify. And this is why, right? A lot of them are getting some pretty nice moves. But there's also a lot of emotion going on right now, right? A lot of emotion. And, you know, the emotional times are fun, they're great. That's where all the, a lot of money is being made as you're seeing these major rallies, right? But the real money is made during quiet times, right? Where it's a lot more quiet. Now, if you followed this channel for a while, what I said was just stick with Bitcoin until 60% dominance and then start to diversify some. Now, we're at 60%, right? Where we have been at 60%. It's just below it right now, 59.5. And so it raises the question, right? Has it topped? Has dominance topped? And if it has, when is ETH Bitcoin going to move? Well, there's a pattern that ETH Bitcoin goes through. And so I'll tell you sort of the latest at which I think it would happen. So if you look historically at ETH Bitcoin, what you'll notice is that it essentially goes through this pattern of sort of a top and then a slightly lower high, right? A top there and then a slightly lower high. You see that? And then again, a top and then a slightly lower high. And then in between those two tops, it sets sort of a low that it becomes important later. And then eventually it breaks below that low and then forms the bottom, right? You can see it pretty clearly, and that's what's happening once again. Just because ETH Bitcoin is at 0.033 does not mean ETH is dead, right? This is the same pattern we've seen happen every single cycle. Now, I tried to warn people about it over the last 3 years, and I was met with a lot of critics. But who cares, right? I mean, I also put out predictions that sometimes don't pan out, right? This one did, but I put out some that don't. And, it's also important to remember to try to stay objective, right? Try to stay objective and to look at the chart in a way that tries to drown out the emotion, right? The FOMO and everything. I've heard a lot of people tell me that, especially people that didn't diversify at all. I mean, like I said, I think they should. They said they missed out on alt season, you know? And I'm like, I'm over here. I'm scratching my head. I'm like, what are you talking about? Right? I mean, like, look at Bitcoin dominance. Alt season is when Bitcoin dominance aggressively goes down, right? That's alt season. These two highlighted areas, right? I mean, this one even extends all the way up here. You can see alt season on the chart, right? It's pretty clear where it was. So imagine someone saying like, "Oh, I missed alt season," and you're looking at the chart, and you're trying to squint. You're like, "Well, where, right? Where are you talking? Are you talking about this? Is that what you're talking about? When Bitcoin goes up, it lifts the altcoin market with it. But just because alts go up does not mean it qualifies as alt season. If your definition of alt season is this, then you haven't actually lived through an alt season, because those who have lived through alt season know what I'm talking about. It's when dominance crashes. Now, dominance hasn't crashed yet. Yes, it's at 59.5, right? But if you were to go over and look at dominance Heikin-Ashi candles on the monthly, imagine if someone came to you and said, oh, dang, I missed alt season. And you're looking at this chart and you're like, what in the hell are you talking about? What are you talking about? Where is it? Point it out to me on the Bitcoin dominance chart. You know what the problem is? The problem is that most people don't value their portfolio in sats. They value it in US dollars. If they valued it in sats, their mind would be trained to think differently. They know that staying with Bitcoin until 60% dominance was a really great strategy. Let's get back to what the video is about, right? ETH Bitcoin. So what gives, right? I mean, when's it going to actually bottom? One of the things I've said before is that it should bottom at the latest. I could be wrong, and I'll try to raise my hand up high if I am. I usually do, right? I don't try to shy away. I mean, if I get something wrong, I come out and tell you guys as soon as I think I'm wrong, so that you're not waiting on my wrong prediction to get even more wrong, right? But I've said for a long time, 0.03 to 0.04 is the target range, and now it's there, right? And I mean, of course, it could go below 0.03, but it's not my base case. It's not my base case. One of the things to remember in terms of the markets is that the valuation. I think my video froze for a second. Satoshi knows I can't afford a new laptop, right? It bleeds against Bitcoin. But a lot of it's sort of time-based capitulation, right? It's not always valuation-based. It's time-based capitulation. And if you look at this chart, one of the things you'll notice is that for whatever reason, ETH Bitcoin likes to bottom out in December or January, right? That doesn't mean it's always putting in a new low, but a lot of times it'll remain weak until that time, then it'll start to move up. So my base case right now, and it is subject to change, but my base case, and I've been pretty clear about this for years now, my base case is that ETH Bitcoin will bottom before February. It'll probably bottom before then, right? I mean, it'll probably bottom well before then. But I'm just saying, like, absolute worst case scenario in my mind as the market stands now is then. Really, what I would say is it's going to bottom probably well before then. A good chance it bottoms anytime. It's possible the bottom is already in. But what I would say is this. I'm sick. Give me a pass. I know it's really hard to talk. which sucks because I mean obviously the markets are moving and I want to be there with you guys. I want to do the live streams, but it's really hard. Um, Last cycle, if you look at ETH Bitcoin, you can see that the bottom was actually put in 2019, but that bottom occurred when the Fed pivoted to QE. Okay, and we haven't seen that yet, right? We still haven't seen that pivot to QE. But that's when it bottomed last cycle. But you can see that even though it bottomed in September, it did come back down in December and then a slightly lower low in January compared to the December monthly candle. You see that? Slightly lower low in January from the December, but it was still a higher low as measured from September. So again, it was not like a price capitulation. It was just more like ETH tends to stay weak, and then really starting in the following year, after a long capitulation year, that's when ETH Bitcoin goes up, right? That's normally when it happens. And you can see that in 2019, and that was one of the years where ETH Bitcoin broke down, right? It started to move up the following year. But then if you look at the following year, the halving year, which is what we're in now, ETH Bitcoin also sold off into December. And then January was a higher low from December. But you can see that the December-January timeframe was where that transition took place. Just like here in 2019, it was the December to January timeframe. That's where the transition took place, where ETH Bitcoin really bottomed out and started moving in the opposite direction. And then you go look at 2016. When did that transition take place, right? It was December to January. You see it? So in all of these cases, that transition took place in December and January. And some of the times the low was in December, like 2016 and 2019, or sorry, 2016 and 2020. And then in 2019 it was in January, but the actual low was earlier in the year in September when QE started. So, and it's possible the low's in November as well. We have actually seen this type of movement before, and I know it seems kind of strange because you're like, well, what's going on? Like, I mean, altcoins are doing well. Why can't ETH join the party? You know, what's going on? Is it a relic? I don't think it's a relic. You know, I don't. And, you know, it's obviously something that I have to ask myself when you see a chart like this. But at the end of the day, I think ETH is better than everything in the cryptoverse except for Bitcoin. I think ETH is better than all that other stuff. And I know I'm going to offend a lot of people, and that's okay. You know, I mean, I know a lot of people disagree with that, but that's what makes it a market. You know, and I defer to the market. ETH's number 2 by market cap, has been number 2 for a long time, and I just think it's going to stay that way. And I'm probably going to be wrong at some point, but that is where I've done really well with ETH over the years, and I've done really well by assuming it's not dead. My Bitcoin valuation predictions on ETH are much better than my USD valuation predictions, and I'm sure many of you have noticed. So perhaps I should just stick with the Bitcoin valuations because, you know, my USD valuations are usually off the mark, right? Usually I'm over predicting where it's going to go, or I'm I'm too bullish on it, or I'm too bearish on it on the USD valuation. But if your mind is trained to think in satoshis, then this is the only chart that matters, right? As far as ETH is concerned. The USD valuation doesn't matter. If your unit of account is Bitcoin, you just were in Bitcoin for the last few years. And that worked out a hell of a lot better than being in ETH. I do think that's going to change in 2025. I think ETH will outperform Bitcoin in 2025. And I think there's going to be some surprises in store. And we'll talk about a little bit more about that in 2025. But I gotta believe, right? I mean, I have to believe that we're gonna see it turn around soon. There's an interesting thing you might notice, and that is if you overlay total 3 divided by Bitcoin onto this chart. We actually saw something similar to this last cycle, in 2020. I'll show you what I mean. So in 2020. There was a moment in time here where alt Bitcoin pairs really started to move, right? They really started to move. Kind of like, or sorry, that this is ETH Bitcoin, right? You can see there's a case where they both really started to move. And here we've seen alt Bitcoin pairs move, and ETH Bitcoin didn't really move that much, right? I mean, it did move a little, right? It's not that it didn't move at all. You can see there was a candle here, right? A 1 week candle where it did go up, right? It did go up. Last cycle, it went up the week of November 16th and the week of November 23rd. That's when ETH Bitcoin went up. This cycle, it went up the week of November 4th. And then it's been down ever since then. But then there was one final drop by it, right? There was one final drop in December. And then it then kind of like bottomed out as the new year came in. One of the interesting things, and I've talked a little bit about this before, if you look at Bitcoin dominance, it's doing something very similar that it did last year, actually. And I know everyone wants to know, like, has dominance topped? It's possible, right? It's possible. I mean, it has gone to 60%. That was always my milestone. But one thing to consider, so one thing to consider is that last year, this almost exact same thing happened with dominance, right? Almost the exact same thing. And what it was when Bitcoin broke out of the range it had been in, dominance found a short-term top, right? In October. You see that? It found a short-term top, and then it sold off. And then in December, dominance then wicked above it. In December. Remember, a lot of times in December, Bitcoin shows relative strength compared to the rest of the market, no matter the direction of Bitcoin USD. And so you could get a repeat of that, right? I mean, and I'm not saying that you can't get Altseason, but you could get a repeat of that where it feels like Altseason is starting, and maybe it is, right? But then you kind of like look back at it a month later and you're like, another high by dominance, Is it possible that happens? It is. In fact, if you go look at year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin dominance, so if you go look at dominance without stables, and you look at it 2024, 2020, 2016, I mean, normally around this time in halving years is when dominance starts moving back up, right? I mean, it's the same thing. Like if you look at all Bitcoin pairs, which are doing absolutely phenomenally right now, by the way, and they're back up to 0.41. But if you look at them, they had a really similar rally, and I've pointed this out many times. They had a really similar rally in November of the last halving year, and then they topped out on November 24th. Right, they topped out on November 24th, and then they slowly went back down. It doesn't have to play out the same way, obviously, but it's one of those things where, if Bitcoin follows, if you look at Bitcoin, if it follows what it did in, say, 2020, 2016, and 2012 in the halving years, right? If it does continue to go up into the year, just kind of like it did in 2023, right? If you look at 2024 to compare to 2023, it was then sort of that next move up that then led to Bitcoin dominance going up again, right? I mean, it moved up, and when it moved up initially, then dominance topped. And then it kind of went sideways for a little bit, and then alt Bitcoin pairs rallied, and then Bitcoin went up again in December, and then when it went up again, then Bitcoin dominance went up again. Now, you guys a lot of people are new to the channel. You're like, well, why is he talking about dominance? Well, I value my portfolio in sats, and I do think it makes sense to have something other than Bitcoin, especially with dominance as high as it is. But in terms of identifying when does Altseason actually start, right? The durable drop of the durable drop of Bitcoin dominance and the durable rally of alt Bitcoin pairs, it makes sense to try to figure out, do you preserve the Satoshi valuation by being in alt, or do you preserve it by being in Bitcoin? Up until a few weeks ago, for me, it was just Bitcoin only, essentially. Not entirely, but like 99% Bitcoin. After dominance hit 60%, I started hedging, right? Because it's possible dominance goes higher, and just like it did last year, but making money's making money, right? I don't think you're probably not that upset if you're sitting in some alts and you're riding them up, right? So that's where I am, right? This is where I am on this stuff. And sort of the reality to it is that Altseason doesn't really start until ETH Bitcoin goes up. Now, I know what you're thinking, right? You're looking at some of the alts, you're like, well, how is this not Altseason, right? How is it not? But again, I think there's a difference between maybe your definition and my definition of Altseason, right? I think there has to be, some level of misunderstanding or lack of communication. My definition of Altseason is where Bitcoin dominance falls off a cliff. And it hasn't yet. It is dropping. It is below 60%, but it still isn't even below the 8-week moving average. It's getting close, but it's still not even below the 8-week moving average, which, it's been mostly above ever since July. Now, last year, you can see that after Bitcoin broke out, it fell to the 8-week, Bitcoin dominance broke out, right? It fell back to the 8-week SMA, and then it actually wicked below it, but then it still went back up into December, like into the, the latter part of the year. So you could see that happen again. Again, at this point, it's more for academic purposes. It's not, I'm not asking you to really base all your investing decisions at this point as of what Bitcoin dominance is going to do. The bulk of the Bitcoin dominance rally is likely over, right? I think if it does go higher, it could go higher, but it doesn't have to go, it's probably not going to go to 73%. Okay, it could go higher in the 60s, but it's probably not going to go to 73, would be my guess. So yeah, I in terms of ETH Bitcoin, my expectation would be that it bottoms out between now. My base case is that it bottoms between now and early January. I'm going to say before February, just to cover myself in case one other thing happens. And the only reason I'm saying it is because last cycle, ETH Bitcoin didn't bottom until QE began. And, the next Fed meeting is December 18th. So there's a chance they begin QE December 18th. There's also a chance they don't begin it until the January meeting, which isn't until the 29th of January, right? So I kind of want to give myself a little wiggle room on that. At the end of the day, in 12 months, it's not going to matter, right? It's not going to matter. In 12 months, ETH Bitcoin should be a lot higher than 0.033, is my guess, right? If you're curious, like if you're an ETH maxi, if you've hated me for 3 years and you're now begrudgingly listening to my view because it's like, all right, well, whatever. Guys, I've been in that position. Like, I've faded certain people's views and then I hated them for it when they were right. It's not about being right at the end of the day, right? It's not about being right. It's about making money. And the reality is the two things are completely different, right? There's a big difference between being right and making money, And so it's not about that. It really isn't. I think that ETH Bitcoin, and ETH Bitcoin's different than ETH USD, right? I'm not suggesting that ETH USD has to sit around and not do anything until December or January. I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm not. And I know a lot of people are going to look at this video and think that, but I'm not. I'm talking about ETH Bitcoin, right? The ETH Bitcoin pair, I think, will start going up sometime between now and early January. Worst case, for my so worst case in my mind would be late January, but I have a hard time seeing it taking that long, right? I mean, I feel like, by the end of December, early January at the latest, it should start moving up if it hasn't already. Is it possible it goes later into January? It's possible. Is it possible I'm completely wrong and it just keeps on bleeding? Yeah. I mean, anything's possible. And it's always worthwhile to consider, the alternative view. But that's not my base case, right? It's not. And I'm not going to pretend like it is. I mean, my base case is that ETH Bitcoin does go up in 2025. I don't know what's going to happen between now and then. I don't. And, we see this every cycle, actually. I mean, a lot of times this happens where ETH kind of lags behind and then people give up on it. And then eventually its Bitcoin valuation makes its move. And it just hasn't happened yet. It's kind of interesting when you look at it because if you think about this entire cycle, ETH Bitcoin never stopped going down, right? It never stopped going down. And that was always my concern. That's why I tried to tell people, like, this was going to happen. This was always going to happen. This is always what happens. It happened in 2019. It happened in 2016. It was going to happen again in 2024. And here it is. Here it is. But I do think it will turn the course in 2025. I do. If you look at the RSI, which is a dubious indicator at best. I mean, I really don't use the RSI for very much. Basically, you know what I use the RSI for? I'll tell you what I use it for. When I have an opinion about something and it's not panning out, I go look at the RSI to try to find some type of confirmation bias to make me feel good. But one thing to look at the RSI is, last cycle, it kind of did something similar where it just kind of, the weekly RSI just kept inching lower, right? It just kind of kept going lower. And you can see that the weekly RSI bottomed in September when QE began. That's when quantitative easing began. That's when the Fed began to expand their balance sheet again, right? That's where, right there, that's where the weekly RSI bottomed for ETH Bitcoin. You can kind of see a similar pattern here, right? I mean, where it's been putting in these lower lows on it. So I don't know if it needs to come all the way back down here or not. I could also just as easily see the case that it, the weekly RSI sort of double bottomed there. But if in late December, early January, everyone's still wondering what the hell's going on with ETH Bitcoin, if you see the weekly RSI down here, right? Currently it's at 32. So down here would be 25, 26, right? If it's down here, then it's probably that same thing. So, and then if you look at quarterly returns for ETH Bitcoin, something interesting you might notice is that there's been a lot of red, a lot of red. But look at the first half of post-halving years, right? Look at the first half of 2021, a lot of green. The first half of 2017, a lot of green. 2023, 2024 has mostly just been red. I mean, there's only been 3 quarters out of the last 3 years that have been green. 3 quarters out of 12. So 1/4 of the quarters over the last 3 years have been green for ETH Bitcoin. Only 1/4 of them. And you had a 26.5% move and a 6% move in 2022. And then you had a 7% move in Q2 of this year. Everything else has been red. But I think it'll change in 2025. That's my base case. That's my base case. And it has been. It has been for a long time. So we'll see what dominance does. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, until we get through the end of the year, it's hard to sort of very strong-willed say the top is in. Like, it could be in. I'm willing to say that at least because it did go above 60%, right? It could be in. But we saw a very similar thing happen last year where it felt like to a lot of people it was in when it went to um when it went here to like 54%, and then it dropped to 51 to 52. And then it still went up about a month later and put in a slightly new higher high, right? So this was 6 weeks, right? So, if you go 6 weeks out from this wick here, that would be the last week of December going into early January, right? The week of December 30th going into early January. The reason why that's important is because there's a good chance that I've mentioned this a few times that Bitcoin could sort of rally into the 1 year anniversary of its ETF launch. We've seen that happen in other asset classes before, where it rallies into sort of that 1 year anniversary of the ETF launch. So you could see dominance sort of do that again, right? Where it drops and then goes up again. And then same kind of thing. The question is then, if it puts in that high, is that the final high, right? Because last cycle it wasn't. It just kept on going higher all year. So what are the chances in 2025 it keeps just going higher all year? I don't think so. It could, but I don't think so. I think QE will probably happen at some point soon, and then you'll see dominance turn around. But those are my thoughts on ETH Bitcoin, and hopefully these thoughts have been useful to you. I'm no longer bearish on the ETH Bitcoin valuation. I don't know where the bottom is. It's got to be close in time. Within the next couple of months, I would think. And I would also argue that in a year, it's not going to matter. In a year, it's not going to matter whether it was 0.034. It's not going to matter if it's 0.03, 0.032. Hell, it probably won't matter if it goes sub 0.03. If it goes sub 0.03, it'll be scary. Honestly, it probably would be a little bit scary, but even in that case, I think ETH would come back in 2025 on its Bitcoin pair. So those are my views, guys. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I've obviously been a lot more active over there recently, just because a lot is going on in the markets, and there's just been a lot of exciting things happening. So we'll see you guys next time. Please subscribe and give the video a thumbs up at the very least. Bye.